Welcome to the January 2022 CIECAST, 2022 and the new norm in the collision industry. I'm Paul Berry, Executive Director for CIECA. The Collision Industry Electronic Commerce Association, or CIECA, develops and promotes electronic communication standards that allow the collision industry to be more efficient. We are currently embarking on a major initiative to develop our next generation of standards, known as the CIECA API standards. We welcome and invite participation from members of the industry who are interested in joining a committee to assist in this initiative. In particular, we need people with technical IT skills who can help develop new JSON-based standards for the industry. As part of our mission to develop industry standards, we also provide webinars like this one to help educate both members and non-members on trends that impact systems, processes, and the exchange of data across the industry. Today's presenter is Susanna Gotsch, Senior Director, Industry Analyst for CCC Intelligent Solutions. She will share insights about trends affecting the industry in 2022 and beyond. And now I'll turn the program over to Susanna Gotsch. Welcome, Susanna.
Thank you, Paul. Well, I'm very happy to be here this afternoon. I appreciate everybody taking the time, and I hope to provide some information that folks find of value. Look forward to questions once we go through the material as well. So as Paul mentioned, the title of our presentation today is 2022 and the New Norm in the Collision Industry. When we look at the overall summary of 2021, industry-wide, we saw claim counts slowly recover throughout the year. We ended up the full year of 2020 up about 10% from where we were in 2020. That was after falling overall claim counts in 2020 of about 20% from 2019. So throughout the course of the year, we saw steady increases month over month. And as we move into 2022, expect further recovery in claim frequency as well. Miles driven overall nationally have recovered, largely recovered. As of November, which is the latest government data, miles driven is only down less than 5%. But where and when and how people are driving remains different, and we'll talk about that as we go through the remainder of the presentation. A lot of that has to do with the fact that a good portion of employees are still working remotely at least one day per week, which leads to reduced congestion on roads. And historically, one of the primary drivers of auto claim frequency had been the same drivers on the same road at the same time, which was typically the occurrence during AM and PM rush hours. With fewer people on the road, we've seen obviously claim frequency fall as a byproduct. As more people return to office, once we pass this most recent wave of the virus, we do anticipate that companies will start to bring their employees back, but how much the hybrid workforce will change things moving forward remains to be seen. Roads, as a result of fewer people on them, particularly during rush hour, remain reduced from a congestion perspective, and we continue to see people driving at faster speeds than they had when they sat in bumper-to-bumper traffic, and also many more reports of reckless driving. The claims data shows we continue to see a change in the makeup of the claims characteristics as a byproduct of some of that reduced congestion, specifically more non-drivable claims and more claims flagged as total loss. We also have seen repair costs climb steadily throughout the year, which we'll talk about, and some of the specific reasons behind that include some of the disruptions from the supply chain, specifically semiconductor chips, and we'll close out with some discussion around where new and used vehicle prices are and what that means to our industry as we move forward into 2022. This is a data set from INRIX from their 2021 Global Traffic Scorecard, and essentially what it shows is the change in travel demand, or essentially traffic volumes, into many of the large downtown metro areas throughout the U.S. And if you look at the overall year of 2021, traffic demand continued to be substantially lower than it had been pre-pandemic, over 20% down on a national basis, with some specific areas like San Francisco almost 50% down from where they had been pre-pandemic. The exception is Las Vegas, but outside of that, many of the particular states, even those states that have seen recovery at a faster rate coming out of the pandemic than others, urban areas such as Miami, Phoenix, they also continue to see their downtown areas experiencing less traffic demand. Data from the U.S. government on tracking U.S. interstate miles shows the change again versus 2019 in the overall traffic volume on interstates, both by trucks and by passenger vehicles, and then the red line shows the combined. Historically, passenger vehicles have accounted for 80+% of all miles driven in the U.S. As e-commerce has surged during the pandemic, we've seen truck share of overall miles driven grow, and we saw truck interstate miles recover much, much more quickly than we have with passenger vehicles. And in fact, it wasn't until the latter part of 2021 where we started to see passenger miles essentially on par with where they had been pre-pandemic. But truck traffic, on the other hand, continues to surge quite a bit ahead of where we are from a passenger vehicle perspective. Interstate miles also, again, are typically pretty indicative of people commuting during rush hours to their workplaces in major urban areas. So it's not surprised that we continue to see urban miles down and interstate miles down as well. Why all this matters is if you look at the chart on the right-hand side, this is the data from NHTSA tracking the number of overall crashes. These are police-reported crashes in the U.S. in 2019 by day of the week and time of the day. And you can see that historically, going back to 2019, a sizable amount, almost 50% of those accidents occurred during weekdays at PM rush hour and at AM rush hour. The chart on the left-hand side shows the data from Castle Systems, which is a system company that provides a lot of the security systems for office buildings. Looking at their 10-city average, showing their estimate of office occupancy rates, we saw a significant drop, obviously back in March of 2020. And we've seen a very slow but fairly steady increase month over month. And until we hit to the time frame for about Thanksgiving, and then we saw that volume dip. And then we get into early December and the Omicron variant, and we saw that drop again. The good news is that the last several weeks, the most recent data being the 12th of January of 2022, we've started to see that number grow again. Again, a pretty diverse mix when we look at it on an individual urban area basis. Certain areas, for example, San Francisco, as of the 12th of January, they're still seeing office occupancy rates hovering around 17%. Whereas cities in Texas, such as Dallas, are at about 40%. So we continue to see a fairly diverse response geographically that obviously has an impact on how soon different states are seeing office or claim frequency return to pre-pandemic levels. But overall, it's pretty safe to say with fewer people going into the office, driving on the road at the same time, that continues to be a factor driving and keeping claim frequency below pre-pandemic levels. From a repair cost perspective, however, what we've seen over the last 5 years is some of the largest increases in overall repair costs that we've ever seen historically. CCC has been reporting on this data back to 1997. And if you look at the data just for the last 5 years, repair costs have been climbing steadily, largely because repair complexity has been growing. The average number of parts replaced per claim have been growing. The average number of labor hours per claim have been growing. But when we hit the pandemic in 2020 and in 2021, with more non-drivable appraisals and even more vehicles than we even had 5 years ago that have a lot more of these complex systems, we saw repair costs surge almost 8% year over year just between 2020 and 2021. When we look at the claim characteristics themselves, the data on the right-hand side tracks by calendar month for the last 6 years what percent of the overall volume of appraisals that were not comprehensive losses were flagged as non-drivable. And you can see that starting back in early 2020, sort of the March, April timeframe, is when we started to see some of those large jumps develop over where we had been in prior years. And then when we get into 2021, which is the farthest bar on the right-hand side, we see those numbers jump even further. February of 2021, as many of you recall, we had essentially 75% of the entire U.S. was covered with some form of ice or snow. So when we had the big freeze in Texas and the catastrophic losses down there associated with that. And so we had almost well over 35% of all losses were flagged as non-drivable. In the subsequent months to that, that non-drive percent has also remained elevated and has continued to grow even beyond the increases that we saw in 2020. Why that matters, the average repair cost for a non-drivable repair can average anywhere between $5,500 to $6,000, while the average drivable loss tends to hover anywhere between about $2,500 and $3,000. So any percentage point increase at all in that non-drive percent can have a pretty significant impact on repair costs overall. Will also, as not surprisingly, have an impact on repair cycle times as well, which we'll talk about in more detail shortly. The chart on the left-hand side shows a similar view, breaking the data down by calendar month for the last 6 years, and shows the percent of appraisals where an airbag was, at least one airbag required replacement on the appraisal. And as you can see, we saw, again, large jumps that began starting in March of 2020 into April, and the 2021 data showed even further increases above and beyond what we experienced in 2020. And it really hadn't been until December that we started to see essentially the 2020 and 21 numbers essentially equivalent, but still well above 2019. If you think about when an airbag deploys, the airbags are typically going to deploy when you have a front impact, where you have the striking vehicle running into something, an object in front of them or a car. Airbag deployment is not something that's typical when you have rear end hits, especially in slower speed traffic. And it's those slower speed congestion type of accidents that, as a byproduct of the pandemic, have seen some of the largest declines. And so subsequently, the remaining mix of all claims shows a more significantly damaged vehicle and higher repair costs and higher overall repair times as a byproduct. If we look at the historical data associated with parts replacements, claims on a per claim basis, this is looking at claims by loss category, collision, liability, and the combined. We've seen a steady increase in the overall number of parts replaced per claim. The left-hand chart shows drivable claims, the right-hand side shows non-drivable. And with part severity up as well due to inflation related to supply chain disruptions, we've seen a fairly significant impact on overall repair costs as a byproduct not only of additional part replacements, but the costs associated with them. And the difference again here between the average drivable loss versus a non-drivable illustrates, for example, the average collision loss as of 2021 required on average about 10 part replacements. The average non-drivable collision loss required well over 24 parts. So as you shift volume towards more non-drivable, you're going to have a higher cost repair, more complexity, more parts needing replacement, etc. But clearly, some of the increases in overall repair costs that we have been seeing, as earlier mentioned, is tied to increasing repair complexity as a result of the vehicle park itself becoming more complex, equipped with more features, whether those be convenience items, things like sensors, whether it's for things like brain sensors or for advanced driver assistance systems. All of those things have added to the complexity of the repair and the number of parts requiring replacement when that vehicle is damaged. And then we hit 2020, 2021, and demand for vehicles and electronics surged. And many of the automakers had actually, at the early part of 2020, canceled a lot of their orders for the semiconductor chips. The average vehicle today now can have as many as 1,000 plus individual semiconductor chips required to operate the growing content of vehicles that is electric. Vehicle manufacturers then struggled as demand for vehicles ramped up. They struggled to get inventory of chips and have subsequently seen production levels significantly hampered in 2021. It's estimated that as many as 10 million fewer vehicles globally were produced in 2020 as a result of fewer semiconductor chips. We also had, as the demand for goods started to recover sharply coming out of the summer months of 2020 into the fall and into 2021, we saw a surge in things like raw material costs, whether that was lumber, copper, rubber, petroleum costs. We saw increases in the cost of labor. So people that were across in many places overseas, finding people that could work, having to schedule fewer people into either mines or factories as a result of COVID protections, drove down productivity levels in terms of getting some of those access to some of those raw materials, getting those raw materials delivered to the factory, getting those goods produced in factories, getting those goods from factories to shipping ports overseas, and the cost of shipping containers as goods being shipped to the U.S., imports surged to the U.S., shipping container prices surged as well. And then when the goods got to ports like Los Angeles and other places on the East Coast, we saw a shortage of workers, again, because of the same COVID restrictions and costs associated with the unloading of those shipping containers, getting those goods onto the trucks, getting them delivered, and then getting those same parts ultimately delivered to body shops. Across the system, we saw delays, but significant increases in added costs. And as a byproduct of that, the U.S. has seen inflation surge. Overall, for all of 2021, inflation was up 7%, which is the most that we've seen since 1982. And so where, not surprisingly, we saw costs impacted specifically as it looks at repair costs for vehicles was the cost of replacement parts. Specifically, when we look at the average aggregate price per part, this is across all part types, whether it's an OEM part or an aftermarket part, whether it was a hood or a hinge for a hood or a quarter panel, the average cost per part rose over 8% in a single year, which, going back to as long as CCC has been collecting and reporting data on this, back to 1997, is the single most largest annual increase that we have seen. Combine that with the increase in the average cost per part, and that explains in large part why we've seen severity and repair costs increase as much as we have in 2021. Moving forward, most analysts expect that we've seen most of the increase in part costs that we are going to see. It's likely not going to see, we're not likely to see part prices reverse substantially, but the large increases that we experienced in 2021 are likely not to be repeated necessarily in 2022. We may see some additional moderate increases in parts, but where most analysts are predicting the industries like the auto industry, the collision repair industry, the insurance industry, and many more, is going to see the most pressure is going to be on wages in 2022. And so while parts historically have accounted for about 42+% of the overall cost of repair, labor has accounted for about 40%. We are all anticipating that we'll start to see more pressure on wages and labor costs as we move forward into 2022. So the likelihood that we will continue to see repair costs rise, perhaps not at the same rate, but continue to rise further, as something that we're all anticipating as we look forward to 2022. Labor hours per appraisal had grown steadily. If you go back to 2011 in this case, this is looking specifically at non-comprehensive. We look specifically at non-comprehensive because PDR labor times are typically just captured as a dollar amount and don't equate necessarily to hours. So looking just at collision and liability losses here, you can see that the last several years have seen some of the largest increases pre-pandemic related to the growth in vehicle complexity, but in the more recent 2 years, in part because we've seen an increase in the non-drive percent of losses and more heavily hit vehicles that require more parts replacements and repair and more labor time associated with that as well. This is data from the Conference Board, who does a number of surveys throughout the course of the year to track across all industries, across all types of workers, whether they're non-exempt, exempt, salaried, to anticipate and survey what companies were budgeting for salary increases for the next year, and structurally what sort of movement that they expected to see in salary budgets across the board. In their last survey from December of 2021, across all industries, their data showed that most industries were planning for close to a 4% increase in their salary budgets for 2022 versus 2021. One of the largest increases that we've seen, obviously, for many years, and significantly larger than the increase we saw coming out of the last Great Recession in the 2007, 8, 9 period. So clearly, all industries are starting to anticipate, are building into budgets some of the increases anticipated for wage pressure across the board. From a shop perspective, this is data from Crash Network and their survey data that is tracking shop backlog. The top chart shows the percent of shops that report that they have no backlog. As of Q4, the Crash data showed that only 4% of shops reported that they had no backlog, 96% reporting that they had at least some backlog. The national average backlog jumped to 3.42 weeks, which is twice the length of the typical fourth quarter backlog and almost 2 full weeks before where it was pre-pandemic. 67% of shops are now scheduling work for out essentially 2 or more weeks in the future. And the 3 key issues reported include parts availability, technician shortage, and delays in getting responses from insurers, either getting an appraiser out to the shop to write the appraisal, adjuster, or to approve supplements, or to review reinspection results. Insurers as well are struggling finding appropriate staffing to meet some of the new demand that we're seeing as claim counts begin to recover coming out of the pandemic. But in general, when we look at the parts availability, repairers are doing whatever they can to do as much of the, capture as much of the full blueprint of the repair, capture the full list of parts needing replacement, particularly as vehicles that are drivable, the last thing that they want to do is bring that vehicle in for repair and then tear the vehicle down for the repair and find additional parts needing replacement and not being able to get those, and essentially take what was a drivable vehicle and now make it a non-drivable. There is hope that we will start to see some improvement in some of the supply chain disruptions. Most automakers are expecting that for example, the semiconductor chip shortages will start to improve in the second half of this year, of 2022, but we're still about 6 months, almost to 12 months out, where we fully anticipate to see a lot of these supply chain disruptions resolved to the point that they are not causing the delays that they have been so far in 2021 and the early part of 2022. From a repair time perspective, we'll talk shortly about what we've seen happen to repair times, but these 2 charts are tracking the actual time that it takes for, these are DRP repairs, from the time that the customer has the estimate to the time that they're actually able to bring their vehicle in for repair. And this data also demonstrates the additional delays that are happening across the entire spectrum, where repairers, essentially just as the Crash data showed, the repair backlog is causing repairers to have to delay when they can bring those vehicles in for that vehicle to start the repairs. And so on a month-by-month basis for both drivable and non-drivable, we've seen the average days from the time that the customer has their estimate to the time that the vehicle is brought in for the repair jump to over 20 days in the third quarter. We actually expect fourth quarter numbers to show further jump as more supplement activity comes in and more actual repairs are scheduled in. And the same for non-drivable, a little bit shorter time frame, because obviously the vehicle is typically sitting in a tow lot or sitting in storage waiting to be repaired, but in general much longer delays than what we had seen pre-pandemic. As a byproduct of, again, vehicle complexity, more part replacements, more labor hours, more non-drives, we've seen a steady shift in overall repair costs into some of these higher dollar brackets. So some of the largest increases in volume have been, for example, within the repairs that are between $5,000 and $10,000, with almost a full 1.5 percentage point increase in the repairs that are $10,000 and higher. The largest decreases, on the other hand, have occurred at the lowest dollar increments. And again, when you have more non-drivable vehicles, more of the repairs take more time. They require more part replacements and shift into some of these higher dollar brackets for repair. And when you have a higher cost repair, you also have longer cycle times. Again, the same repair brackets for these are DRP repairs. We're tracking the vehicle into vehicle out days average by repair cost range. And you can see that for each $1,000 increment, we essentially see an additional 2 full days in the overall repair time or keys to keys time that that vehicle is in the shop. The majority of that time obviously is the actual repair time itself. But overall, industry-wide, DRP repairs are now taking over 12 days, 2 full days above where they were in 2020, and a little less than 2 full days longer than they were in 2019. Again, a byproduct of 2 things. Overall, within each repair bracket, we've seen repair times climb, but we're also seeing more repairs shift into these higher dollar repair brackets where cycle times are longer. And by the time we get to a $10,000 repair or higher, the average repair time exceeds 35 days. So substantially longer periods of time. And subsequently, we hear more carriers saying that their customers are experiencing issues with they run out of their rental allocated days based on their policies. And many carriers have said that they're looking at the number of days within their policies to determine whether those should be adjusted to help consumers, especially with those with a rental policy where they're having to pick up the additional costs because the repair is taking longer now than it might have historically. When we look at the difference in repairs by dollar bracket, there's a couple other important things that are worth noting. The overall time from the loss report to the vehicle out is higher as the time grows, but we also see a decline in customer satisfaction. So a vehicle repair with a cost of $10,000 or higher, the net promoter score on average is below 80 at 79, while those in the lower brackets tend to be at about 89 or 90. At the same time, we see the overall time from vehicle into vehicle out, the number of cycle times or that keys to keys grow. But then also importantly, worth noting is the percent of customers that indicate that they had to bring their vehicle back for additional work after they had picked it up also grows. And we also know if the customer has to bring their vehicle back, there also tends to have a pretty big hit on customer satisfaction. One area that shops can potentially improve on is keeping their customers informed. And given the fact that we have many fewer customers reporting that they felt they were kept informed in the higher dollar brackets, potentially provides repairers the opportunity to over communicate in some cases or communicate more to some of those customers with the higher dollars, repairs to help them feel like they know what's going on and that they have full transparency into the repair process. But certainly as repairs continue to climb and the cost of repair continues to climb, the impact and understanding the impact to customer satisfaction, cycle time, and keeping customers informed is going to become ever more important. From a repair time perspective, on the left-hand side, we're looking at the non-drive percent of DRP repairs by quarter. And you can see across all 4 quarters in 2021, we saw significantly higher numbers of non-drivable vehicles. And the 2 charts on the right-hand side show the hit that the industry has experienced as it relates to productivity. The labor hours per repair day for both drivable repairs and non-drivable repairs has fallen. Again, a lot of this, when we talk to repairers, has to do with shortage of technicians, qualified technicians, having to balance COVID restrictions, having to balance employees being out with COVID, allowing for the appropriate number of days for employees that have been contracted COVID to quarantine appropriately. All of these have had a pretty significant hit on overall productivity. And as we move into 2022, in the near term, with many repairers seeing repair volumes grow, but still unable to find the technicians to help complete the work, we expect that we'll continue to see labor hours per repair day remain below where it was pandemic. Total loss frequency as an overall number had been growing steadily prior to the pandemic. roughly 1 percentage point or below year over year, so between 0.5% and 1 full percentage point increase in total loss frequency. In part, this had been because we had seen the overall fleet of vehicles on the road in the U.S. grow, more vehicles that were older, lasting longer. The average percent of vehicles that are 16 years of age and older, total loss frequency tends to be as high as about 45%. So if you have more of those vehicles lasting longer, it's going to help drive up that overall number. But anytime you drive up impact severity or accident severity, we also see total loss frequency grow. And with the cost of parts surging as much as it had and the number of parts and labor hours also growing, cost rose sharply this year. And we saw in 2020 and 21 total loss frequency rise. 2021 did fall from a total loss frequency perspective from where it peaked in 2020. But in part, that had most to do with what happened on the used vehicle side. Used vehicle CPI, Bureau of Labor data shows that used vehicle prices, the index for used vehicles, increased 27% in a single year in 2021. With shortage of semiconductor chips, many fewer new vehicles were produced. Those new vehicles that were being produced were largely shifted to some of the higher dollar, higher return rates for the OEs, some of the more expensive vehicles that are more profitable. Many people were priced out of the new car market or couldn't even find a vehicle that they desired, and so that shifted more consumers to the used market. The used market also was struggling from fewer vehicles available, less supply. Early on in the pandemic, rental car companies, for example, started to defleet. But as the demand for rental cars rose during the pandemic, as people avoided airlines and instead potentially used vehicles for vacations, vehicle demand grew. And we saw first-time buyers, the numbers of first-time buyers grow for the first time in many, many years. And so we had high demand for both new and used vehicles at a time of very tight supply for both new and used vehicles. And not surprisingly, we saw vehicle prices surge. So as you raise the price of new vehicles and used vehicles, it takes longer, even as repair costs are climbing sharply, to hit that threshold. And so if we break this same data down by quarter, first and second quarter of 2021, total loss frequency was above where it was in 2020, and it wasn't until the third and fourth quarter that we started to see total loss frequency start to fall. But we ended up still across the board up 2021 over 2019, but down slightly from 2020. We do anticipate to see some leveling off in used vehicle prices in 2022. Most analysts expect that as more new vehicles are produced, that will help improve the situation there, will make more supply available on the new side, and help alleviate some of the pressure on the used side. But if you look at who has seen some of the most significant drops in new vehicle purchases over the last several years, it was within the fleets, whether it was business fleets, rental fleets, government fleets, and leases, both of which have been a primary source of inventory for the used market in the last several years. More people at the end of lease are now holding onto their vehicles than ever before. Over 60% of people's lease originations now, people are choosing to purchase that vehicle at the end of lease now, versus less than 40% prior to the pandemic. So we're now seeing fewer vehicles enter the supply of used vehicles. With continued high demand and continued tight supply, prices will remain elevated through 2022, but we do anticipate not that the industry won't see the same level of increase, but likely not a lot of relief from the higher prices in 2022. So that will help keep total loss frequency slightly below where it was in 2020. But once we get beyond that point, we anticipate that we'll continue to see slight year-over-year increments in total loss frequency moving forward. This is a chart that shows 3 of the key indices tracking used vehicle prices. The dark black line, which is the Bureau of Labor CPI, I spoke about at the outset, which is essentially tracking CPI across all cities in the US. And year over year, the average used vehicle index grew 27%. Wholesale prices, which is essentially what dealers pay for used vehicles at the wholesale market for them to buy and sell on their lots. Wholesale prices alone, according to the Manheim Index, were up almost 50% in the month of December alone. And then finally, the Black Book Used Vehicle Retention Index tracks the average 4-year-old vehicle and how much of its value it retains from its original transaction price. And so across the board, all 3 of those indices saw significant increases from some minor drops that they experienced early on at the pandemic, whether that's sort of the April-May timeframe, and ended up the full year significantly higher than any time previously in history, and certainly much, much higher than they had been pre-pandemic. The first several weeks of 2022 volume, we do continue to see most of these indices continue to remain high. Typically during the tax return season, we see these indices jump. There's some seasonality that occurs. And this year, because we have more consumers that have spent less money on things like travel, more people potentially had gotten some money from some of the during the pandemic from the government. And so consumers are a lot of pent-up demand for vehicles. So it's anticipated that minimally through the first 6 months of the year, we may see some further increases in used vehicle prices, but again, not to the degree that we saw coming into 2020 and 2021. Finally, when we look at the repairs themselves, we continue to see a growth in the number of repairs that include dollar entries on the estimate for either a scan or a calibration. We ended up Q4 just below 50%, but that number will grow as more supplement activity comes in. When we look at where on an appraisal most scan entries and calibration entries occur, on scans, about 50% of scans occur on supplements. The other remaining 50% are added during supplement activity. From a calibration perspective, about 30% of calibration entries appear on the original estimate, and about 70% appear on a supplement, either supplement 1, 2, or 3 or more or higher. And so clearly, as more supplement activity comes in, as more vehicles are brought in for repair, we'll see those numbers grow. But in total, we've seen a substantial increase in the number from where we had been back in 2017, where it was less than 3% of all claims included an entry for a dollar value with a scan. Now, just because it's not in the estimate doesn't necessarily mean a scan was not performed. And that's obviously what we're tracking here is when an entry was actually added to the estimate with a dollar value associated with it. But it's the sort of the directionally the overall increase that just underscores just how much more significantly the industry is now adding these appropriate operations to the repair as repair complexity and the types of vehicles needing repair are requiring these types of operations. From a calibration perspective, again, we've seen that number grow steadily. Again, we expect to see the fourth quarter number jump even further as more supplement activity comes in. And the fees per calibration continue to see a lot of volatility. The average, for example, fees include things as low as $10 for the average reset of a tire pressure monitor system, all the way to $3,000 for a 360-degree camera. And so many of these fees are associated with reset of some of the ADAS technologies that are appearing on more vehicles. The recent data report outs from the 20 automakers who had committed to equipping all of their vehicles of 8,500 curb weight shows that vehicles manufactured and sold in the U.S., produced for the U.S. market and sold in the U.S. between September 1st of 2020 and August 31st of 2021, over 80% of those vehicles were minimally equipped with ADAS. Obviously, the average age of vehicles on the road in the U.S. remains 12.1 years, but as more and more vehicles being purchased continue to have these systems, we expect to see the percent of appraisals and the overall repair complexity grow in the coming years. Finally, if we look at the overall registration share of vehicles, we do know, though, that the majority of vehicles on the road still are not equipped with these systems. The exception is rear camera. As of 2019, roughly 40% of vehicles on the road, registered vehicles in the US, based on projections by IAHS and HILDI, are believed to have been equipped with a rear camera. That was a feature, however, that NHTSA required be mandatory as of May 2018. But some of the other systems, whether it's the automatic emergency braking or the lane departure warning, we continue to see the vast majority of vehicles on the road not yet equipped with that technology, although that number is expected to grow. Roughly just over 5% as of 2019, registered vehicles on the road in the US were equipped with front automatic emergency braking. By 2024, it's estimated to be as high as 30%. And certainly what we do know about ADAS is that its growth in the population of vehicles is steady, but historically it's taken about 35 years for new vehicle features to reach about 95% of all registered vehicles. As we look at the market and the impact of ADAS, what we do know is that prior to the pandemic, there have been good research showing that ADAS was very effective in the certain types of accidents in which it was best designed to work. Specifically, direct front to rear types of accidents that had been typical with congestion traffic, where people were driving in back bumper to bumper traffic, and one car might have rear-ended another because they were not paying attention. We saw a reduction or effectiveness of these systems where they were reducing anywhere from 25 to 50% of those types of accidents. But at the same time, we also know that that type of traffic pattern has changed. Many of these systems are designed to work up to a certain speed, but once they reach a speed of 25 miles or more, the vehicle is not necessarily designed, the technology is not necessarily designed to slow the vehicle enough to avoid impact, but it may mitigate the speed of the vehicle before impact. But we do know that because of the technology on the vehicle, when you have the same vehicle with and without ADAS side by side with the same level of intrusion into the vehicle, the cost of repair is higher and will take longer for the ADAS equipped vehicle. So as we move forward and more vehicles become equipped with these features, while there had been anticipated some slow, but very slow overall impact to claim frequency, the pandemic has certainly clouded that picture quite a bit. We have more people traveling at higher speeds, more distracted driving, and many of these ADAS features are now being introduced with other features such as lane departure warning and adaptive cruise control that have been shown to actually encourage in some situations some driver distraction. So certainly the picture is not necessarily as clear as it had been, but one that as an industry we'll be watching very closely moving forward. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about what we expect as it relates to EVs and hybrids. Overall EV share as of 2021, we had seen overall registrations grow to about 2.6% of all vehicles in operation in the US were electric vehicles. But from a share of sales were almost 10% or more in 2021. So clearly we continue to see and anticipate we'll see new vehicle sales, EV share of new vehicle sales jump even further in 2022. The lion's share of those EVs continue to be from one specific automaker, although we continue to see some of the other automakers gain share in 2021. And with the number of new EV models expected in 2022, expect some more competition in the marketplace as we move forward. But when we look at overall claims volume, the EV share of overall volume from an overall appraisal perspective was less than 1% in 2021, just over 0.5%. And nearly 40% of those were in California alone. The next closest state was Texas, that accounted for 7% of the overall national volume, Florida 5%, and New York a little bit over 5%. So clearly, as repairers in the marketplace prepare for their ability to repair these types of vehicles, they have a lot of decisions to make around the timing and market-specific dynamics that might encourage them to make those investments sooner than later. From an insurance and both repair perspective, and as we've seen across many industries, we saw increased adoption of digital capabilities. Overall, the CCC industry repairable appraisal volume as of 2021, over 22% of appraisals are now being generated with a photo estimate. On the repairer side, we also saw a significant uptick in the number of repairers that are now using photo estimating with their customers, 140% increase in adoption of that, and more customers relying on things like the ability to review customer reviews, look at certifications, location, hours, etc. on CarWise. And so clearly, as we move forward, consumers appreciate and want more capability to connect in a digital manner, and we expect that some of these trends will continue to see further growth in the coming years. So I'll wrap up, and then I'll be happy to take some questions from the audience. But in general, we saw claim counts recover month over month, steady growth throughout the full year of 2021. Again, as more people return to the office in 2022, whether it's, we get to a point where the pandemic is declared an endemic, or we feel we have enough people vaccinated where people feel comfortable going into the office, or people have, we've seen the reduction in the number of variants. All of those will remain driving recovery, but in general, we continue to see and anticipate that we'll see continued growth in claim counts. New and used vehicle sales are expected to remain strong. January numbers so far are down a little bit beyond what most had anticipated. Again, some of that is because of the Omicron variant, but also availability of an inventory. But as those inventory shortages are alleviated, we expect many more people to take care of that pent-up demand, and many of them will be choosing EVs or vehicles that have more of the ADAS technology, both of which will continue to drive repair complexity and also cost and repair times. And inflation is likely going to keep part prices elevated through the first half of 2022 and potentially even to the full year. But really, the largest increases in 2022 we anticipate to come from the labor side of the equation. But clearly, as we look forward, the industry, whether it's from the pandemic or longer term from ADAS technologies, we will continue the trend that we've seen developing slowly over time, which is that the industry is going to continue to see slightly fewer but more complex, expensive repairs become the norm. So thank you, everybody, for your time today. And Stacy, if there's any questions, I'll be happy to take those, or Paul.
Great, thank you, Susanna. Our first question is, as more new cars with airbags come into the fleet, is that helping to drive up the number of cars with airbags deployed, or more cars that shut down operation post-impact?
In part, yes. However, I'll just go back to that slide. In the U.S., all passenger vehicles with a airbag, 1997 passenger vehicles were required to have a passenger side airbag or a driver side airbag. By 1998, all vehicles in the U.S. had to come equipped with a driver side and passenger side. Light trucks was essentially a couple years right after that. So we're now looking at the majority of vehicles on the road sold in the U.S. after 1997 are equipped with airbags. So some of the increases in prior years may have been tied in part to that, but we were not seeing the types of increases that we had seen in 2020 and 21, which were specifically tied to not only the delta V of the crash increasing, but we saw the number of front impacts increase beyond well above what we have seen historically, both for collision and liability losses. And historically, 45+% of front impacts are for collision loss, or collision losses, 45% of those were front impacts. Historically, among liability losses, about 55% were rear impacts, but even among liability losses, we saw a shift away from rear impacts to front impacts. And obviously that's where the airbag technology is really designed to work most. That, and also side impacts, that also saw a slight increase as the number of rear impacts fell.
Thanks, Susanna. Could the current trucker convoy or any similar future protests have an effect on supply chains or prices? How many trucks would have to boycott to make an impact?
Well, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on the fleet business per se, but I think, certainly, there are a number of significant challenges when we look at the trucking industry. We had some new regulations put in place. Some of those regulations were reversed by the Trump administration, but clearly we, like a lot of industries, the trucking industry is struggling to find workers. Truckers were the ones that were out there on the roads, on the highways, when the rest of us in the early part of the pandemic were sheltering at home, and certainly sacrificed, considerably. But like a lot of workforces, it's an aging workforce, and they're having difficulty attracting new people into the industry, both because the wages are not maybe as competitive as other industries and are not as high, but it certainly doesn't have the cachet as, some of the other industries, might have. And so many companies, fleet companies, have struggled to keep drivers and keep them employed and happy. We've also seen the surge in the number of goods being shipped by truck. The number of imports in the U.S. In mid-2020 surpassed, imports into the U.S. surpassed, in terms of volume of goods, surpassed where they were pre-pandemic. So we had fewer people available to drive trucks at a time where we had significantly more demand. And so as trucking companies raise rates and raise labor wages to attract drivers, they're passing those costs along, and those costs are being then added into the cost of parts. So if it were significant enough, it could have a very big impact. It could cause significantly more delays in repairs than what we've already seen to date. But a lot of this is sort of been slowly building, and a convoy may draw attention to it, and get a lot more media attention, and potentially more attraction from the government to help, step in and help build some programs to make that type of work more desirable. But it's hard to know exactly what the whether there would be an immediate impact that would be lasting on the cost of parts.
Thanks for the insight, Susanna. Due to part supply challenges, increased cycle time, salvage values, and shop staffing challenges, do you think total losses will increase?
So I think one of the challenges as an industry that we have is, and certainly I think the OEs to a certain extent are at the forefront of this right now, dealing with this as it relates to the semiconductor chip shortage. For years, more and more content has been added to vehicles by the OEs. Some of it's safety related, whether it's crash avoidance technologies or convenience items. And what the semiconductor chip shortage has highlighted is that a lot of that technology has added costs, and it has now, OEs are having to balance which of those features are really most important. I think it was one of the OEs made headlines because they had initially announced that they were potentially going to they were going to roll vehicles off the line without heated seats. And that got a lot of attention because everybody likes their heated seats, but there might be another feature that is being added that requires a semiconductor chip that is less desirable. So as content has grown, repair complexity has grown, and cost of repair has grown. Repair times have grown, and so when you get to a car that has, thousands of semiconductor chips and all sorts of electronic equipment, and you've got repair times that are taking upwards of 30 days, it's not you might start at an MSRP of $60,000, but after 4 years, that car is roughly worth less than half. And it doesn't take very long to hit a point where it makes more sense from an economic perspective, but also from an overall customer satisfaction perspective, that vehicle be totaled. And so that's the balance that we've largely seen playing out prior to the pandemic. And across all ages, we had seen total loss frequency steadily increase. It wasn't until we saw that value of the vehicles jump as much as they had that it's now taking substantially more damage to get to that threshold. But I think over the next 5 years, as some of that normalizes again and retention values, for example, maybe slip back to where they were pre-pandemic, we're going to continue to see similar challenges in terms of total loss frequency.
Thanks, Susanna. Our next question refers to the ADAS slide. Do the ADAS slide percentages refer to new vehicles registered that year or total vehicles on the road for the year shown?
Total vehicles shown. So all vehicles in operation in the U.S.
Okay, great. And what is the expected estimated inflation percentage for repairable vehicle costs in 2022?
So our best guess at this point is after about an 8% increase in 20, or more than just below an 8% increase so far is what we're registering for all of 2021. Based on the fact that repair costs have been climbing close to 5% even prior to the pandemic, we anticipate repair costs will likely climb between 5 and another 8% in 2022.
Thank you. Is there any data available that can provide us with an average cost of repair for ADAS equipment based on manufacturer?
So certainly, a lot of it depends on what you might classify as ADAS equipment. Really ADAS is a combination of many technologies. It's cameras, it's LiDAR, it's radar, it's sensors. And so as a general rule of thumb, those components can range in price anywhere from, less than $100 to thousands of dollars for example, maybe a distance sensor on a luxury vehicle. So if you're using CCC One, obviously you have access to that information. Outside of that, obviously, I'm sure, on the internet, you could probably find some of the information associated with that. But again, because it's such a broad range of technologies, that sort of fall under that bracket, there isn't necessarily a designated list.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation and all of your insight. We have several people on the phone who are curious if this has been recorded, and the recording will be available on the CIECA.com website as well as CIECA's YouTube station later on today. Paul, back to you.
Great, thank you. Great information, Susanna. We really appreciate you taking time to share it with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody's time today. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. CIECA has partnered with the Automotive Management Institute. Attendees of this webinar are eligible to receive credit towards a professional designation from AMI after taking a short quiz on its website. A link will be sent to all attendees, and as Stacy mentioned, the presentation has been recorded and will be available later at CIECA.com. You'll receive an email with the link to that. So thank you very much. Please follow CIECA's social media platforms to stay up to date on upcoming events and CIECA news. And that concludes today's webinar. Thank you.